Yay. All right. Oof. Sorry about all that. So we're going to be talking about understanding and managing imposter syndrome today. This is kind of the path we'll take. So we're going to look at some definitions, many of them, terminology, what imposter syndrome and imposterism is not, some prevalence, how many people actually experience it, some theories about maybe some developmental influences on it, some indicators and characteristics of it, the actual cycle itself that might look familiar to you, and how when we're experiencing imposterism, we kind of measure our competence, and there are 5 ways we do that. What's likely happening in the brain, and then we'll look at some interventions. So an introduction about me, first of all, I am Jane Jenkins. I'm a psychologist in Washington. I've been with the Veterinary Mental Health Services as a facilitator for just over 3 years. I've been a psychologist in a veterinary teaching hospital since 2020. My PhD focus was on human-animal interactions and human-animal bond. So veterinarians and the work that you all do is really dear to my heart. And I'm a lifelong animal lover. This is my current crew. 3 horses, 2 dogs, all rescues except the corgi. So I have a kind of an affinity for rescuing little animals that need help. So what is a definition of imposter syndrome? The original researchers, Clance and Imes, looked at whole population of highly achieving women. And what they found was that they all had this internal experience of intellectual phoniness, like not quite being enough or feeling that they were lucky. And then most recently, in a new book that just came out, they've sort of gotten more comprehensive with it. So now they're looking at it as the tendency of high achieving individuals to misattribute their tangible and or visible success to external factors like luck, rather than to their innate traits. It's also called several things: imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon, fraud syndrome. You can see the rest of these definitions here. So we're going to be looking at this from kind of a different way. So I want to move away from the term syndrome because it focuses on kind of blaming the individual. What we want to use, and I use, is imposterism, because that reflects a more flexible approach to understanding behaviors associated with it that are very, very much less about the person and more about the person combined with the environment they're operating within. And we'll get into more of that later. So I'm just going to call it imposterism because that seems to capture it without blame or without pathologizing someone. So what imposterism isn't, it's not self-doubt. So when we think about self-doubt, that's actually a very natural part of life. When we're learning something new, trying something new, of course we have self-doubt. We're unsure, it's new. And then we can have this ruminating about overall competence if we're receiving negative feedback from someone, which would also be pretty typical. It's also pretty stable. Self-doubt is pretty stable, and it shows up kind of everywhere for us in these new novel things, or if we're receiving some sort of evaluation. Imposterism is not like that. It's usually pretty domain specific and can be inconsistent. So maybe you rock it at home where you're comfortable and you feel belonging there and like that's your space, but at work you're less sure. So all that those feelings of fraudulence or that you're lucky or not as smart as other people might pop up for you. So those are the differences. So the way that we can kind of differentiate is to go ask ourselves, is it manageable self-doubt I'm experiencing, or is it legitimate feelings of not belonging or an accurate reading of an environment that doesn't feel super accepting for me? So I hope by now you're starting to catch kind of a drift of, it's partly the person, it's largely the environment you're operating in. So that context of environment has a whole lot to do with it. So who actually experiences it? About 82% of people overall have experienced imposterism at least once, but specifically anybody operating in environments where they are underrepresented. So it's especially higher for people of color, because they may not see people like them where they work. So then they just kind of get this vibe they don't belong. With LGBTQ folks, trans, non-binary specifically, they may have an internal theme of not being either woman or man enough to belong in the environment they're trying to operate in. And then millennials, funny enough, high levels of social comparison that leads to imposterism because of their early attachment and growing up with technology that kind of taught them that. So 3 areas. And then high achievers in general. Really cool study by Lori Kogan out of Colorado State looked at about 600 veterinarians internationally. 68% of them experienced imposterism at some point in their career. And this probably won't be a surprising statistic, but those who were in practice less than 5 years were twice more likely to experience it than those that had been in practice for over 20. So where might this come from? These are simply theories. They are not, researched out, particularly the developmental one and the overfocus on the bottom, because that's mine. But developmentally, there's some thought that imposter feelings can be predicted by paternal overprotection. So you have this fatherly figure that protects you, handles things, controls things, and you don't really learn to struggle and get there yourself and then internalize that success. So that may lead to feeling like not quite as good as everybody else, or I'm a fraud. I didn't do this on my own. Another theory is that kids that received achievement-related messages that were inconsistent, invalidating, or even confusing had a lot to do with how they internalize their overall abilities. So, for example, maybe you have a sibling that's 2 years older than you, and they're the smart one, and you're the social one. But you feel like you're the smart one, and so you work really hard as a kid, but you don't quite meet their expectations. You might develop or be, I guess, susceptible to develop some sort of imposterism mindset. Same thing could happen if they told you, oh, you're super smart, you're going to do all the things. That adds a lot of pressure to a kid. So then, of course, that's going to perpetuate, oh my goodness, I'm never doing enough. Oh my goodness, I'm not as smart as everybody else. I'm a fraud. I'm just lucky. So some of those things might predict some susceptibility. And then inadequate self-reinforcement when you were developing skills. So could you do something, have it be really hard, and then do some like internalized validation, like I worked really hard on that. I'm very proud of myself. So not creating those skills might lead to more kind of weakness for imposterism in some ways. And then whatever cultural systemic messages we receive. There's a new term that just came out. Wonderful book I just got by Coakley and colleagues called Racialized Imposter Syndrome. And that's where lack of representation or people with shared identities within your environment really impact your sense of belonging and then your sense of, am I imposter and am I an imposter or not? So folks may question their worth. They may negatively evaluate things that happen interpersonally. And this is going to lead to doubting your capabilities and competency, right? And that's going to also lead to more experience of lack of belonging. And then my own little thing, just from my experience working with veterinarians, is there's this overfocus for some on humility over pride. Like, I'm not allowed to be proud of what I do because that's going to make me arrogant. So this overfocus on being humble really feeds into imposterism because it can't ever own anything. So if you can't own it, you can't internalize it. So just something that I've noticed, again, totally anecdotally. So then what are some indicators of imposterism? So we have achievement driven by internalized doubt. We don't have achievement driven by like the want to do better, right? We're just trying to reduce our doubt. So that's what achievement is driven by. We have relief versus pride after an accomplishment. You can see the problems that would bring up. Feeling isolated in it, like I'm the only one feels like I'm an imposter. And then performing below potential because you don't feel like you belong somewhere. If there's nobody like you in the work environment, you can get this self-fulfilling prophecy going, right? And it's really damaging. And then you will also miss out on opportunities to succeed because of the number one, achievement driven by internalized doubt. You're not going to reach for things that you might fail at because you don't want to fail. That's like scary. So what are some characteristics of imposterism? So tasks create high anxiety, perfectionistic tendencies. I wish I had enough time to do the connection between imposterism and perfectionism. They are cousins for sure. Having difficulty accepting praise and discounting positive feedback. I've experienced a lot of folks, and I used to be one myself, that I would say, oh no, it was easier. Oh no. Just discounting any positive feedback about what you've done. Attributing any success to luck or hard work, never your ability. Feeling like your own abilities are probably overestimated by others because you're not recognizing them yourself. Feeling like your presence is a fluke. Fear of being rejected, of course. And then this highly self-critical inner voice that creates cognitive distortions that we don't question. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. So here's the actual kind of one of the first models of imposter cycle. So see if any of this resonates with you. So in the upper left-hand box, we have this achievement-related task. So that's the thing we have to do. If you go to the right, it almost immediately brings on feelings of anxiety, the self-doubt comes, worry about if you're going to be able to do it well, get in trouble, whatever. All those things start swirling around in your head. So that usually leads to one of two approaches. Either we over-prepare or we procrastinate. So at either level, we either over-prepare, procrastinate, we end up accomplishing it. We get this feeling of relief, and then we get positive feedback, but we always discount the positive feedback. So at first, the over-preparers will say, well, it was my effort. I worked really hard. And then the procrastinators like, well, it was just luck because I did it all at the last minute. It's usually all really quality work either way, but we discount the positive feedback and we never, ever relate it to our ability. And then we go to the left again, we go up the left side. So we have this perceived feeling of fraudulence, then our self-doubt goes up. It can lead to depressive symptoms, and it definitely perpetuates anxiety. So you can imagine how all that in the backpack is going to impact the next task we have to do. So it's this thing that just goes around and around and around. So there are 5 ways that folks with imposterism kind of measure their competence. The first one is the perfectionist. So that person expects to perform everything flawlessly 100% of the time, and falling short at all triggers fraudulent feelings. Then we have the soloist. They should do it all the time. They never need help. They never need to ask anyone. And if they have to, then they're a failure. So see if any of these resonate for you. And then we have the natural genius. The natural genius bases their competence on how easy and how fast they can learn things and do things. The problem with that is there's no struggling allowed, and they have to nail it on the very first attempt. They can't have a learning curve of any type. So you can see all the problems that that's going to bring up. And then we have the expert. Competence for the expert is based on what and how much they know. So any minor gap equals total failure. It's very black and white. And then we have the superhero, superhuman. So that is where competence is based on how many things that they can be awesome at. So that means they have to be awesome at everything they try. So they can't fall short in any role. This seems to be particularly prevalent in women because historically we had to succeed at home, rock our house life, rock our career life, keep the whole boat floating. And that has actually attributed to a lot of superhumanness in women. So what's going on in the brain? I always like to look at what's happening in the brain. So what we have is a bottom up, which is a kind of a stress response reaction versus a top down, which would come through the prefrontal cortex. And we could have some control over it if it was top down, because then we have time to interpret and challenge it. Bottom up is very reactive. It's a very reactive cycle. So what we have is that we have reduced activity in the hippocampus where our memory is. So we can't reflect on all the times we did well. We have reduced functioning in Broca's area, which is language, particularly self-talk. So we can't like encourage ourselves, talk to ourselves, and then reduced activity in our prefrontal cortex, which is where all the higher order things happen, judgment, knowledge, reasoning. But we do have increased activity in our stress response areas, which is our HPA axis, which you will know as the fight or flight response. So that remains active all the time in this. So we have this low level chronic stress, my little scare bear is there. It impacts our body, and it's a response, they think, researchers think, to fear of social pain. Nobody wants to feel they don't belong. Nobody wants to reinforce that by failing, right? So it gets very, very, it's a very fragile system. It also leads to cognitive distortions, which we'll talk about more in a minute. Well, actually, we'll talk about them right now. So disqualifying the positive means that we can't have a balance between what I did wrong and what I did right. It's either I did well because the test was easy, or I did well because I was lucky. It's never like, maybe I was a little lucky, but I was also pretty good at it. So that's disqualifying the positive. Then we have emotional reasoning, which is I feel a way, so it must be true. So if you fill in the blanks, I feel like an imposter, so I must be. And then the last one, overgeneralizing. That means I made one mistake, so that proves I'm incompetent. There's a saying like one aw crap cancels out 9 attagirls or attaboys. That rings true in this case. We make one mistake and we discount everything positive that we did. So we never get to hold on to that. So there are some what I call survival strategies triggered by imposterism. These are from that little scare bear. So they're automatic stress responses. So procrastination, putting things off until the last minute. When we procrastinate, we actually reduce our anxiety in the moment. So it's very seductive. But it actually comes back higher because then, of course, time went by and we're feeling pressure. Perfectionism, so over preparing, as I was talking about in the cycle, in the imposter cycle. Fussing over unimportant details, which I can tell you I did for this presentation. Sometimes I try to find this one perfect picture, and I don't need to, but I do it because it distracts me from the stress of, is this going to be an okay presentation? So I align very, very closely with the fussing over unimportant details. Escapism, so just absolutely checking out. Maybe we watch TV because we don't have to think. It's a very mindless activity. Or we can eat our body weight in snacks because that raises dopamine and we're not thinking about the pressure that's going to be caused. Catastrophizing, so that's circular thinking. So that's like this roundabout thought about the worst possible outcome that just goes around and builds on itself until all of a sudden we're homeless living in a box somewhere. And then deflection. So that's, we talked about that a little bit a minute ago, but letting any praise or positive feedback bounce off. Because if it sinks in, then we're at risk of being rejected. So if we receive nothing, there's no risk. This all perpetuates and is a result of stress. So it's unhelpful for us. But in the moments, we don't really know that. So what can you do? There are a few things we can do. I have a few notes here because I do get a little bit nervous, so I want to make sure I don't forget anything. We can address those cognitive distortions. There are kind of 3 things we can do, and a little 4th one in parentheses specifically for imposterism. So we can notice our thoughts, we can challenge them, and we can reframe them once our emotional response goes down a little bit. We don't really problem solve well and be super stressed at the same time. That's not how our brains are made. We can do a little bit of it. But if you get really emotional, you're not thinking about things. That's why if you have an argument with somebody and you think about all the great things you wanted to say afterward, it's because now your emotions have gone down and you have access to those things. But I kind of look at it like a toggle. If you're in prefrontal cortex thinking, you're probably not super emotional. You probably all have to compartmentalize for your work. And if you get too emotional, you're not going to be able to think and problem solve. So we have to make sure that our emotions have calmed down so that we can think. But then we say, what was I thinking to myself? This is the notice part. What did I just say to myself? And is that like perpetuating some imposter belief? And then we can challenge it. How do I actually know this is accurate? What is the evidence for that? Or is it just a thought in my head? Sometimes we can look at it like, what would my best friend say to me about that, to get some outside perspective on just what you think they might say. And then we reframe it. So what would I say to them if they told me this same story? Could I help them? Can I find shades of gray that balance it a little bit? And then we want to normalize it. Having imposterism symptoms or feelings can be normal, right? If we normalize it and say, of course I felt like an imposter. Of course it's going to happen sometimes. Then we're reducing pressure to fix what feels like a personal problem. And if we can flip the narrative, we can then say, well, how could anyone not feel like an imposter in this situation? That's going to connect us to our community, to where we belong, and it's going to reduce maybe the impacts of the imposterism. You can talk about it. That's number 2. Sharing feelings about it can reduce those feelings of isolation, like you're the only one that feels that way, and it can create opportunities for corrective experiences. I also look at this as permission for other people to then share with you, because it makes, when you're vulnerable, they have permission to be vulnerable too. You can celebrate your successes. So I often will assign to people at my work, recognize what you knew and what you learned at the end of the day, instead of all the things you did wrong. Accept accolades, respond positively about yourself. At the very minimum, just say thank you. Try not to discount yourself. If you're really brave, you can say, thank you. I worked really hard to learn that. I really worked really hard to perfect that procedure. And then try really hard to notice and let go of any perfectionism that's in there. That's super hard. It's very prevalent in science-based careers. I know that. And if you're aware of it, you can start to like chip away at it a little bit. So adjust your standards so you can focus on progress instead of perfection. We don't learn unless we make mistakes. So maybe you can say to yourself, instead of I don't know, I didn't know it, I don't know how to do it yet. And then share your failures. Discussing them with other people paints a realistic picture for everyone, and again, gives them permission to also not be thinking they have to be all the perfect things. And then sometimes you just have to accept it. Acknowledge the feelings, accept they're going to come up every once in a while. You're in high stakes careers, so of course it's going to pop up. Cultivate self-compassion. So use mindfulness to shift from an external locus of self-worth, which is outside things you don't have control over, to an internal one where you get to define who you are. And then add realistic little tidbits to your self-talk. So for example, if somebody had to write a grant and they need grant money and they're saying to themselves, I have to get a grant, I have to get a grant, that's going to maybe pop up some imposterism. However, if you can shift that a teensy bit to make it more realistic, maybe I need to get out at least 10 grant applications and fail at most of them, which is what happens, to land one. That's a little more realistic. And then you can practice being a humble realist. I love this term. This is in the new book I was mentioning, and there's a picture of it at the end. You'll probably think you'll get a link to see this and you can look at it. But the humble realist, they view competence as including awareness and appreciation for one's knowledge and abilities, but also respect for the humanness of the limitations. As humans, we are limited. Sometimes we don't give ourselves that kind of grace. The second thing they do is they model healthy response to failure, mistakes, setbacks, and negative feedback. So whenever we see any of those words, we should be thinking about, or hope to be thinking about, what did I learn? What can I take forward that makes meaning of this so that I can do better? Rather than kind of letting the imposterism just perpetuate and perpetuate, and then we're just talking negatively to ourselves. Self-criticism is probably I think the most prevalent thing I work with in my field here, working with veterinarians. So be nice to yourself. And if you don't know how to do that, then see me and we will figure it out. And then the last thing they do is they show a certain amount of fear and self-doubt that should go with the territory of achievement. So they're accepting that. I'm going to feel this discomfort of learning. It's okay that I don't know it, and it doesn't make me an imposter. It makes me a learner. So a minute about self-compassion. Self-compassion kind of increases that sense of belongingness because it connects you to humanity. So there are three pillars. One is to just be nice to yourself. Just be nice. The second is to connect to your shared humanness, whatever you're going through. Other people have probably gone through it too. We're just not able to see it sometimes. And then three, mindfulness. And all mindfulness is in this context is just being aware of your feelings without judging them, just noticing how you're feeling. So, an example on the bottom, you could say for number one, I'm okay just as I am. I'm not perfect. That's okay. For number two, for common humanity, I have abilities and shortcomings just like everyone else. And number three, for mindfulness, I'm aware I'm having these feelings that I don't belong, and that's okay, because that's how you would probably treat someone else. And then try, if you can, in your, I don't know what all your situations are, but sometimes we're in a big place and we can't see the belonging and the bigness of it, but we can create a little pod of safety. So if you can find a little space, big or small, to kind of foster and create a sense of belonging for yourself and other people that you're working with, that's going to really help everyone with imposterism. And this is especially true if you're a member of a well-represented group. If you can see someone who maybe doesn't look or doesn't have identities like everyone else, you might be able to reach out to them and say, hey, I see you and you belong here. So how can I help you feel like you belong here? And then we can look for opportunities to provide social support. Like if you see someone struggling, ask them like, how can I help you? Can we get a cup of coffee? What's going on for you? And just listen. It might help them address their fear of negative evaluation because they don't know what you're thinking. So they're going to predict what you're thinking, which probably isn't what you're thinking. That is called mind reading, and we do it all the time. When we don't know the answer, we kind of make it up for ourselves. So watch for that and help others not feel that. And with that, the book on the left is the one I was just talking about. I just got it. I perused it. There's so much rich information in there. I'm so excited to have it. I highly recommend it. And then the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook is always great. And then here are some references for you. And I'm sure you'll have access to this, so don't worry about it. And then I just want to thank you for being here. If you want any additional information about VMHS, please contact Dr. Katie Lawler. She's a wonderful human, and she can direct you anywhere you need to go. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Oh, you're welcome, Debbie.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Are you available to speak at our orientation?